these issues are so personal and so, I think, existential, because if you deny people's mental health, because it is you lose yourself. It's a terrifying situation when you have one of these illnesses. And so it's not just saving a life physically, it's saving the person, the essential person who's been held hostage by a brain illness. That is a nuclear power in terms of its consequences on people's lives. So I believe, we're in a very polarized world politically, but I believe these issues are the issues that would unify, just because of these experiences that I'm sharing, unify people across party lines, because they are so much more visceral than even the most visceral, toxic reactivity to each other, because one's one side of the aisle and the other's another side of the aisle.
Welcome to Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Schaap, co-founder of Social Driver. Washington is the center of influence in the US and arguably the world. We are featuring leaders who figured out how to break through in today's fragmented and noisy world. Social Driver teamed up with the Communications Board and the George Washington University College of Professional Studies to recognize these leaders as chief influencers and highlight how they inspire and influence others. I'm thrilled to introduce today's guest, the Honorable Patrick J. Kennedy, the nation's leading political voice on mental illness, addiction, and other brain diseases. Before we dive in, I want to share a few things about the Congressman, who I personally admire for his courage, persistence, and humanity. By sharing his own health challenges, Patrick has made an incredible impact on public policy and on the lives of countless Americans. During his 16-year career representing Rhode Island in Congress, Patrick Kennedy fought a national battle to end medical and societal discrimination against mental illness and addiction, highlighted by his lead sponsorship of the Mental Health Parity and Addictions Equity Act of 2008. The son of Senator Ted Kennedy, Patrick decided to leave Congress not long after his father's death to devote his career to advocacy for brain diseases and to create a new, healthier life and start a family. He founded the Kennedy Forum, which unites the community of mental health, and co-founded One Mind. Kennedy is the author of the New York Times bestseller, A Common Struggle, a personal journey through the past and future of mental illness and addiction, a book that I simply couldn't put down until I finished it. Last year, he followed this up with the acclaimed and equally inspiring Profiles in Mental Health Courage. Patrick, you have been called many things: Congressman, best-selling author, Society of Biological Psychiatry's Humanitarian of the Year, a transformational leader by the 11th Judicial Circuit, a Voice of Recovery Award winner, and we could go on and on with awards here. Today, we are thrilled to call you a chief influencer. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I really appreciate the kind words. Great to be with you.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. I want to start to tell you first, your book, A Common Struggle. It really captivated me. It's not only a history of mental health and public policy over the last 60 years, but it's a very personal story about your own life and your own journey. And I understand that the book was written, that you were scheduled to go on 60 Minutes, and then it almost wasn't published. Can you talk about what happened?
Well, these days, everybody's talking about having lived experience or a diagnosis of one kind or another, or they're openly talking about being in recovery or seeing therapists. I mean, it is now kind of passé. I first kind of got into this whole field because the guy that I was in drug rehab with decided to sell the story of being my roommate in drug rehab up at Spofford Hall in New Hampshire. When I was going into my second term as a state rep, and I was on the cover of the National Enquirer, Patrick Kennedy, drug addict. And so I, at the time, this is back in 1991, for sure thought that was the end of my short-lived political career, because the last thing I wanted was that to come out. And of course, back then, those types of headlines were career ending. Of course, these days with, every day what people survive politically is breathtaking, especially when compared to 20 years before that. But Nonetheless, when I was coming out with my book, that was like really over the edge, to actually tell things about my own life and that of my family's. Now, nothing that I said about my family was anything that hadn't already been written about, pretty extensively. But the reason I called my book A Common Struggle, even though people would say, well, there's nothing common about being a Kennedy, is because, especially my family, all the things that you wouldn't want written about your family were already written. And frankly, you could go to the Kennedy section of the bookstore and read about all the stuff that should be a family secret. But even with all of that being widely known, I felt like I was spilling the beans because the terror of talking out loud about things that were widely known. I mean, everybody knew my dad had a drinking problem. Everybody knew my mother, suffered tremendously from both alcoholism and depression, been hospitalized numbers of times. Everybody knew about other family members who had suffered from addiction and trauma. I mean, obviously, my family had been traumatized with assassinations of my uncles and so forth. But it was a really big deal, like breaking the sound barrier for me to actually talk about this openly. Because when I was growing up, uh, these were things that the opposition, i.e., Republicans, would attack my family on. Like it was an attack on our character that we had these illnesses, which still at that time growing up were seen as character flaws, not chemistry issues. They were, and so even in 2015, they were still. It was hard to break out of that kind of family ethos that you just don't talk about it,
Yeah.
and it was seen as a betrayal of family loyalty to talk out loud about those things. So when I did complete my book, and of course you have these rollouts, and 60 Minutes was one of them. I had a big kind of reaction from my family that was very negative, extremely negative, like the kind of negative where you wonder, how long is it going to be before I talk to these people again? And again, the shocking thing is I never said anything shocking, right? Like it wasn't like I was betraying my family by talking out of school, but to the general public to even say, that your father had a drinking problem and self-medicated the trauma of his brother's assassination. I mean, that seemed like really out on the cutting edge of being transparent. And that was so widely known for years and years. And to talk about my mother's alcoholism was not betraying her confidence. They spoke about her own alcoholism for years. And of course, like me, had never had any choice on being anonymous or not, which of course is a big thing in this recovery space. Suffice it to say, there was a lot of pressure on me to pull up the oars and not move forward with the book.
And yet you did. And I think it's obviously been so important for so many people that you did. But one thing, you mentioned the family things that you covered in the book were, things that had been reported on or people knew about. But there were times in the book where you talked about specific details of your own struggles and issues that happened, that some of which were covered and you're kind of, you're describing it from your point of view, but that some weren't. And I thought sometimes, wow, like he could have left that out, but he was willing to share that example as part of this because you had a lot of detail in there. And I guess I'm wondering, what did it mean for you to be able to own your own story? Because we've heard from a lot of our other chief influencers just the power of owning your own story and that authenticity. makes a real impact when you're trying to influence others. And obviously, this has been very influential in terms of how others see your story, your family's story, but also the story of all Americans that are struggling with this common struggle and why changes to public policy have been needed and are needed.
Well, the paradox is I've lived in a life where my survival politically depends on what other people think of me, not what do I think of myself, like the man in the mirror, so to speak.
Mm,
Um, and the irony is these days, if you are all right with yourself, it shows. So,
mm,
like, if I'm not obsessed and consumed with what social influencers, other people think of me, then I'm going to be successful in life because it's so easy to get sidetracked and yanked around based upon what other people's opinions and impressions and shoulds would look like. You should do this, you should do that. And if you can be released from that, being hostage to that instinct, which is, by the way, very, uh, you know, primal to be concerned about what others think of you, especially in politics where it's taken to the nth degree, then you really can rock and roll. Like I have believed like this mental health issue is going to be an existential issue, just period. Like I just knew it internally, couldn't put words to it. My family suffered from it. Incredible shame and stigma. And you would have thought maybe when the end of the Iraq-Afghan war, when so many of our veterans were suffering from the quote signature wounds of war, which is trauma and traumatic brain injury, that we as a nation would have like doubled down on our investment in neuroscience. But that never happened. You would have thought after COVID and the isolation and the fact that people had time to realize that this mental health thing was everybody's challenge, not just those that are those people's challenge. You would have thought the government, the stakeholders, the major players would have invested and come up with really more sophisticated, organized solutions to these challenges, which, by the way, has never happened. I mean, there's been a lot of more kind of talking openly, but that has not translated into any serious change in the status quo, which continues to leave people suffering, continues
yeah.
to have people die their own hands or overdoses and so forth. So, but that has never been like what's propelled me. Like I've just believed that this is going to be something, and it's also connects with me, so I just drive through it. Like
Yeah.
I know, as a former congressman, as a someone with name ID and ability to kind of have economic wherewithal because of those opportunities, I could go in any number of directions because I could say to myself, well, this thing isn't really panning out, like I might try something different. But if it makes sense to me, regardless of whether it makes sense to the outside world, it will work
Yeah.
because I am believe in it, whether anyone else does. And if you look back in history at the people who have made a big difference, they've been guided by their own internal, compass. My
Hmm.
dad said in his book, A True Compass. And then the world kind of came around to their view. So I
Yeah.
just know that I don't have to worry about what other things are going on around the world. Just make sure I do my own knitting and follow my
Yeah.
own compass, so to speak.
Well, and I think that gets to the heart of leading versus following, right? Is leaders on an issue often are the ones that are out there early, just by definition. And part of that leadership is around getting people to see your point of view. You were the lead sponsor of the landmark Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. And that was passed with bipartisan support and signed into law by President George W. Bush. And I wonder if you could share what advice you have for leaders who are trying to navigate during a polarizing time, but to get different points of view together to make a change the way that you did so successfully in the book? I mean, we won't be able to go into all of it, but I mean, there was a version in the House and there was a version in the Senate, and you and your dad were at odds over what should be in this legislation, and you just kept pushing forward, and it would not have taken the form it did, without your leadership and persistence. So, just for leaders trying to navigate a polarizing time and get everybody around a vision, I'd love to just hear what you learned from that experience and the work that you're doing now.
Well, ironically, 2 years before we passed the parity law, that was like kind of the worst moment in my both political career and my personal life with respect to the time. At that time, my addiction was really in a terrible place. And I had driven into the United States Capitol in my car at 3 in the morning. I had nearly run over a Capitol police officer because I was driving in a blackout along the sidewalk. I mean, it was horrendous. And it would be safe to say that I thought my political life was done at that point. I had people back in Rhode Island saying he should just hang it up. It was a question as to whether I should even run in the Democratic primary and things of that sort. When I got back from rehab, I was walking around the Capitol, and an incredible thing happened. I had colleagues of mine who I had never had a conversation with stop me and ask to meet with me, over dinner, at lunch, whatever, breakfast. And that never stopped. That happened every day and went on to happen throughout the rest of my time in Congress. I knew, well over 24 of my colleagues that were also in recovery, that no one else knew about were in recovery. And I knew a good many more who were struggling with addiction that, in fact, I was able to help get treatment. I mean, can't make it up that, I got Republican votes for the bill in committee when, even back then that it was kind of you had to vote on the party line, because of the experience that I had elicited their own telling of their experience to me, because it made me realize I was the only drug addict that they knew in Congress. And so the benefit to me was that I wasn't anonymous, and therefore every room I went into on Capitol Hill, everyone else who had been suffering or in recovery came up to self-identify, which means every reception I went to, I ran into, others that were, so that I wasn't alone everywhere I went. I even had one of the biggest, labor leaders make an appointment to see me. And I mean, he came in and I, of course, so you'll have your staff because staff does all the work. And he wanted nothing to do with anybody in the staff. He just wanted to sit down and tell me what had gone on in his life. And he shared that with me. He shared something really, really personal about growing up and being molested, basically, um, by a Catholic priest. And he felt this challenge in his life because it caused so much disability in his life. And he asked me whether I could set up a meeting with Cardinal McCarrick. Now, I mean, well, Cardinal McCarrick, I mean, that's a big deal. Like Cardinal McCarrick's a big wheel. And the notion that I'm going to get Cardinal McCarrick to sit down with someone so this person can unload on them and the Catholic Church on the history of that. But of course, I was so moved by his faith that I could be empathetic because I had been through something traumatic, and he just felt for some reason. And of course, it didn't matter that he didn't have addiction, but it didn't matter. He got the point of being broken. That's the part he identified with me. And I remember it was like yesterday. I asked Cardinal McCarrick for the meeting. We went to meet him. And I didn't tell McCarrick who I was bringing because then it would have killed the meeting. And like McCarrick's eyes wide open when this fellow walked in. And then he proceeded to break into tears and tell Cardinal McCarrick about
Mm.
how he had been molested. And the thought that this guy, who's like masculine, macho, labor union guy, would have shared what he shared with me, let alone had felt that I was the one who could fill this void and heal this breach for him. So of course he did, and as you know, McCarrick ultimately was found out later on had been part of that terrible tragedy and legacy of abuse within the Catholic Church, and covered some of it up himself. Um, and I remember several years after I left Congress, I'm sitting on a plane. I open up the New York Times, and there on the cover is Cardinal McCarrick, um, and the sex abuse scandal. And I got a phone call. It was like strange, right at that moment, as I'm sitting looking at the front page of the New York Times, and it was that labor leader. And he said, I'm looking at this paper. I said, you know what? How eerie it is. I'm looking at that paper. He said, I will never forget the opportunity you gave me to tell my truth.
Yeah.
And anyway, I am the most blessed person there is. So experiences like that happen to me all the time now. And in my local church, there's this couple that are heads of like kind of the lambs of God. I mean, these are folks that are protesting from Planned Parenthood. My wife ran for Congress up here, so everyone knows pro-choice, everything. But when their son was on the street and needed help, because of my book, they called me because they didn't know anyone else who had ever had any familiarity with these issues. And of course, right away, because I know everybody, I called the hospital. I got them brought in right away. I got my friend who runs a local rehab to scholarship him, and didn't think, because I end up doing that frequently just because it's a blessing that I can do that because it gets me out of myself. It gives me a chance to be of service. 4 years later, I'm baptizing my baby, my youngest child, and that fella who I didn't know was standing there next to me, baptizing his child. And the two parents, who are the most ultra right conservative Republicans, standing behind him and weeping, and they wrapped their arms around Amy and myself and said, if you ever need anything, you call on us because we'll be there for you. And it made me feel like these issues are so personal and so, I think, existential, because if you deny people's mental health, because it is you lose yourself. It's a terrifying situation when you have one of these illnesses. And so it's not just saving a life physically, it's saving the person, that essential person who's been held hostage by a brain illness. That is a nuclear power in terms of its consequences on people's lives. So I believe, we're in a very polarized world politically, but I believe these issues are the issues that would unify, just because of these experiences that I'm sharing, unify people across party lines, because they are so much more visceral than even the most visceral, toxic reactivity to each other, because one's one side of the aisle and the other's another side of the aisle.
Those are really powerful stories. And, the piece I'm kind of pulling from it, even beyond the issues of mental health and addiction, are just that, finding those commonalities, finding those common struggles, whatever they may be, is really the way that you build those bridges and kind of go beyond those surface polarizing issues. But it's only possible when you're vulnerable enough to share your own story and your own struggle. You publishing this book and you sharing your story has now made you a magnet for people who are seeking help or who, want to talk about these issues. And in some cases, obviously, like the car accident that you had on the Hill, that became a magnet too. Obviously, you didn't do that for that purpose, but because folks knew about that, they were coming up to you in receptions. And I think it's a good reminder for leaders that it can be very scary to be authentic and vulnerable. And sometimes maybe it happens by accident. And at the time you think this is the worst thing in the world. But in your case, in some ways, those terrible experiences became a blessing because it allowed you to be a magnet for folks who needed help and to build those bridges with people who you might disagree with on many things, but now they've become your allies in this fight that you're on. This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. I'm a proud GW graduate myself, and I can attest that the faculty members combine academic rigor with real-world lessons that can't always be found in textbooks. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information.
So when I got the first National Enquirer thing, I thought my political career was over. That turned out to be a blessing because what ended up happening is now I was able to survive that politically. And because of that, I was able to dive into the issue that really was personal to me, but which I'd always felt constrained about talking about or being part of because of the stigma around these things. But since I survived a political election, and then I got elected to Congress, I could put my name on these bills because I wasn't afraid that there was some secret anymore. And then because of the car accident, I got propelled in terms of my connectivity with my colleagues in a way that I think did contribute to the ultimate passage of the bill, ironically, because I was able to, when I went and met with people saying, we have to get this done, they didn't look at it as, oh, he's just got some political issue he wants to barter. I mean, they knew it was like visceral, and people reacted differently as a result of that. And Chris Dodd, was the one who got this thing done ultimately. And I had grown up with Chris and a good friend of my dad. And, he has personal within his family. Every family does. And he was clearly like open and ready to go to the wall to make this happen. And he ended up being chairman of the banking committee at a time when the banks collapsed in 2008. So he's the most powerful guy on the Hill, writing the Economic Stabilization Act to save our country from going into another economic depression. And you know what he did? He wrote that whole bill worth $750 billion, whatever, into my HR 1424, the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, passing the House version because he wrote the Senate compromise language into the House bill and made the House bill the bill, underlying bill. So, again, if I hadn't been there and people felt like they had a personal connection, there may not have been the urgency to do it. So then that ended up being the difference in my life. And then I ultimately had to leave Congress because, I've got a chronic illness, and being in Washington is not necessarily very conducive to good sobriety. So, and I thought that was the end of my life. I ended up, here in New Jersey. I didn't have a staff. I didn't have a political office. I didn't know what I was going to do with myself. And, it's just amazing that turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me in my life, because now I've got an incredible partner and my wife, Amy. I've got 5 kids. I'm going to basketball. Went to a doubleheader for my daughter, who's 11 years old, last night. She hit one of her free throw shots, and the night was magic. Like, I would never have known that if I had done what I thought I needed or wanted to do in my life. That would never have happened. So the point I'm making is there is a bigger agenda in this world than our own, and we come to grips with it every time we try to do what we want to do, and we're handed back a different, rule book and a different guide, and not the one that we wanted, but that life works out in spite of that, and oftentimes works out a lot better than it would have had you been the one to decide which way you thought you would have wanted to go. So Life looks
Really.
better in the rear view mirror often, and hindsight's 2020. It doesn't always make sense for people when you're looking forward. But you have to be guided now in my life. Obviously, I've got a very profound relationship with my God, and I pray and I try to think of what I'm doing today to help make a difference.
Hmm.
And that somehow works itself out. I don't know the decisions I make today, how they calculate in some big, you know, cosmos of moves that I could make to get somewhere. I don't know what that somewhere is. I just know today I've got to do something, and it
Hmm.
will work out the way it's supposed to work out. That's a big
Yeah.
relief. And you spend most of your life trying to get it done the way you think it needs to get done. It's a big learning lesson for everyone to realize that you're not ultimately the one that makes those decisions.
Absolutely. Well, you talked about that major pivot point of leaving Congress. After you did that, you've founded two different nonprofits. I want to talk about the gathering of 10,000 neuroscientists that you spoke to, because you followed a bunch of very technical talks at that event with a very different kind of presentation. You hearken back to President John F. Kennedy's famous moonshot speech to inspire that audience. And you told them that we have to do for the inner space of the brain what we once did for outer space. And you even called those scientists the astronauts of the brain, which I just thought is such a cool way to get an audience jazzed up and see the amazing role that they can play. I wonder if you could talk. I mean, you're just such an expert in this. What have you learned about creating narratives and telling stories that connect with and inspire audiences? And those audiences, in your case, are as varied as scientists and skeptics to patients and even presidents.
Yeah, well, I was so fortunate in my life because wherever I went, I had this last name by accident of birth. And everywhere I went, being in public life was a gift because when I was chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, or I was asked to go and do events around the country, no one knew who I was, but they knew that, quote, Congressman Kennedy or Chairman Kennedy is coming. And it actually happened to me where I would show up at an event and someone came out and said, well, when is Congressman Kennedy going to get here? So I knew and had enough humility about the fact that, I was carrying this bigger kind of narrative with me beyond any of my own making. But what it did was it really instilled in me the magic that particularly President Kennedy had when he, this famous admonition, ask not what your country could do for you, but what you can do for your country. It lit a spark in America that everyone felt they could do something that was a bigger calling than themselves to help their country, serve in the Peace Corps, help get the nuclear test ban treaty,
Hmm.
help address, domestic and international challenges together. Um, that spirit was just, I've seen it throughout my life, and venture to Native American reservations, and people would talk to me about how they still have pictures of my uncle Bobby when he ran in 68 for president, and talked all about how a country that denies its indigenous people what it was denying its Native Americans, how could that be a great country in a first world? And I would go to communities of color, and people would tell me about either my uncle breaking fast with Cesar Chavez, or marching with Dr. King, or and there's the Civil Rights Act of '63. There were powerful narratives that ran throughout my family's life. So for me to tap into that was not any big deal. Like I was very fortunate, like when you said, I called these uh, neuroscientists astronauts, and I said that we had to go to inner space, not outer space. Like, frankly, because I have the last name Kennedy, that stuff works. Where maybe if I were trying to do that on my own, it wouldn't work. But I had enough insight growing up around my family to know what really connects, because I had been out there on the front lines and experienced what really resonated with people. And, in President Kennedy's library in Boston, they have this terrific amphitheater where the whole amphitheater shakes when they run the film footage of the rocket going up, and the whole room, and it's so loud. And then they have that quote, you know, of John F. Kennedy when he said, "We don't do these things because they're easy. We do them because they're hard." And, so I got the soundtrack and the video, and I ran that at this San Diego convention hall, which you could park 4 747s in. I mean, it was just, you know, 60,000. I mean, it was the most, I didn't know there were that many neuroscientists in the world. But I got the thing turned up, and the whole amphitheater was shaking, and the rocket. And I said, "You all are the ones that are going to deliver on the promise that our country can move forward on this big endeavor to solve the challenges of inner space and help us reconnect the galaxy of neurons so people can walk again, they can live fuller lives, they don't have to be disabled by trauma and traumatic brain injury and all these neurodegenerative disorders, let alone affective disorders." And afterwards, I had like the smartest people in the world come up to me. I had Steve Hyman, who's head of the Broad Institute at MIT, came up to me and he said, "Patrick, tell me what you want me to do." I had Tom Insel, great friend as well, come up and he said, just tell me what you need me to do. So, that's when we created One Mind, because our narrative is we have to be like the moonshot of one mind. We have to integrate all the systems, because really the race to space was about integrating all these different systems of technology to create the one mission. Mm-hmm. And same with brain research. You have to get the genome, proteome, metabolome, phenome. You have to line up all the science on so many layers to a common goal. And the goal is, how do we get that answer to these therapeutics that are going to help change people's lives? And they are so smart. But, we all need narratives, because narratives, to your point, and which your podcast focuses on, influencers, narratives count for a lot. So facts and credibility and all that counts for a lot, but also you got to put that and marry it to a narrative, and together, then you're able to make an influential, ask or a pitch or a campaign.
Yeah.
So
it's such a great example of telling a story. I mean, I wish I could have been in that room to hear that talk and how you brought the footage in, and because you can just see, I mean, just reading about it on the page, you can just imagine how that energized that group of people. And then, you hear the story of folks coming up to you afterwards saying, "Okay, I want to be part of this," and how that, turned into One Mind.
Well, I really want to say I am like a huge fan of neuroscience. Like, I get to, because we do these awards for these brilliant neuroscientists, hear about the possibilities of finding these various interventions. And when I hear it, I am just so fired up with the possibility. And I think to myself, if more Americans could hear these neuroscientists talk about the discoveries, just like a previous generation was fixated on, Neil Armstrong stepping on the moon, like, people would be jazzed. And I think we would be so much more into investing in neuroscience. And I frankly think globally, we would tie us together, because the only way we're going to really unlock mysteries of the brain is if we get a global effort with, by the way, the supercomputing power that was brought to us from going to outer space, because the supercomputer was really originated as an effort to try to build the scientific and technological and data capacity to go to the moon. Now it's of a time where we can use it to actually do incredible calculations we never otherwise could imagine doing. But what we need is everybody involved, because it's not like some drug trial where you have a cohort of people. You need everybody, kind of like donating blood. Like we need everybody to
Yeah.
be part of what is replicable science. So the same science in Australia and China and Europe is being done here. And then we get to real answers much quicker than we would if we waited, pridefully, like, oh, we have to do it just in the United States.
You talked about, I mean, kind of this is the genesis of One Mind and the importance of this sort of, the future of brain science. But you also created the Kennedy Forum. And one of the things that I think is so amazing about that organization is how you build coalitions, and you've just brought so many different perspectives and points of view together to identify, policies that can make an impact to really build on the momentum of your landmark federal parity legislation. Can you talk a little bit about the Kennedy Forum, but in particular from our audience standpoint? I know they're also thinking about how do you build successful coalitions, because everybody knows that they work, but they're not easy. And you've done that so well, in many ways over the years. But I think the Kennedy Forum today is a good example of that.
Well, again, I mean, I can't take credit for it. I have this tremendous name that just got sparks so much imagination. And we launched the Kennedy Forum on the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy signing the Community Mental Health Act of 1963. It was the last bill he signed before he was assassinated. And if you think about what we need today to solve our mental health and addiction challenges, we need community. Yes, we need new pharmaceuticals. Yes, we need great medical interventions. Yes, we need more clinicians. But we need community, which means it's everyone's job to be part of this, which sounds, oh, well, geez, that's too big. But when you think today, the most incredible thing is, supportive housing, a supportive employment, and social supports probably can do more to reduce rearrests and rehospitalizations of those with severe and persistent mental illness and those with addiction than any other medical intervention. Any other medical intervention, I think, could be dwarfed by the power of community, housing, supportive employment, social supports. Fountain House is a great example in New York. There's recovery community organizations around the country. There are terrific community organizations that are built. So, but that is not the medical model. I had the chance to write the parity law. And of course, I knew that what really is the secret sauce to recovery is this non-tangible, spiritual, psychic change that happens in the person when they realize that moment of clarity that they can no longer go on living the way they used to live. That, in my view, is the thing that really helps propel people into a positive life course. And and I knew, because when I did the parity law, we have to get the money where we can get it. Where do we get it? Well, this thing called insurance is how we pay for healthcare. Well, guess what? It pays for medical care, but part of the real dimension of treatment and recovery from mental illness and addiction is this thing called the spiritual malady, the psychic change, the mental piece to it, which is really elusive to the medical world. They don't really train clinicians to know much about it. It's obviously starting to change, but still, majority of the medical community, as evidenced by the fact that we don't pay for mental health care, a fraction of what we pay for the rest of healthcare, just illustrates that we really have had this aversion to talking about how do we solve this mental health piece. And the irony is it's going to take things beyond the House of Medicine to help change the House of Medicine to get better, quote, health and medical results. Because we all know you address the underlying mental health issues and the rest of your heart disease, diabetes, cancer, all of that gets so much better if you address the mental health aspect. But mental health is never integrated. And as I said, clinicians are never trained. And this is all seen as soft science. So until we tackle this, we're really not going to get to that final yard uh, to score. This is going to be the thing that impedes us. So as a nation, we must address how do we improve this idea of helping people with these existential crises that are mental health related. Addiction is a mental illness. And that's the key, frankly. So what I am interested in terms of coalitions is how do we get the heart and mind together? Like the heart, if you have depression, you're 4 times more likely to have a heart attack. If you have cancer and you have anxiety, which is obvious you're going to have if you've got a fatal diagnosis in many cases, and you're not treating the anxiety, you're not going to be compliant as a cancer patient. And if you have diabetes and you're not looking at your drinking or, it's just so integrated, and yet we still don't have this piece of the healthcare system ironed out. But we have to, not for the quote mental health per se, which is the way we silo this. We think, oh, that's the mental health issue. No. This is about the health issue for everyone with every disease is a mental health aspect of it. And yet in our thinking, we've just siloed this as a separate diagnosis that's over there. Why are we spending that money on mental health over there? With totally ignoring the fact of how integral it is to the rest of healthcare. So I'm hoping, with this new administration, they're going to break, things. And there could be an opportunity in them breaking things if they decide, well, we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world by far, and we have fewer and fewer Americans able to access healthcare and without becoming bankrupt. Like there's something fundamentally wrong. What are we going to do to fix this system, to acknowledge the new world we live in? The new world we live in is not the old hospital. You got to get really sick and then we pay for the surgeon. The new model is how do we keep us as a population healthier? How do we bring more access to primary care? Primary care, fraction of the overall healthcare budget, but the biggest influencer in terms of healthcare outcomes. Like, how do we realign what we pay for? And so, I'm hopeful that we can, take the best of this kind of new radical, let's change everything up approach the new administration's trying to bring and inform it with, well, if you want to take on the sacred cows, if you want to shake things up, here's what you do. And actually, according to you, you get more value for your money. For example, if you fund things like, community health centers, which are bipartisan, which reach into most, red state America, where there is a deficit of access to care, Republicans may say, hey, this thing called federally qualified health centers are the key to, making America healthy again. I mean, I would love to see. The only way you tackle chronic illnesses is you tackle them in a comprehensive way. Well, what is the one part of the healthcare system that tackles people's needs comprehensively? Community health centers. They're not a series of one-off procedures. Their whole focus is the whole person. That's kind of the model we need. So how ironic would it be to have Republicans be champions of what the original progressive Democrats felt was the answer to this world's healthcare challenges? I mean, that would be turning things on its head. And maybe we have an opportunity to do that. We certainly have to try.
I'd love to ask you on this topic. I mean, you talk about the change that we need to see, and there's an opportunity in this moment of disruption. And one of the things we've learned from some of our other chief influencers is that using other people's stories and voices and faces is a really powerful way for an influencer to scale their impact. And your latest book, which came out last year, Profiles in Mental Health Courage, it does that so well. It's not focused on your own story. It's focused on the story of people from a variety of backgrounds dealing with mental health and addiction. And I wonder if you could just say something about that, because as a strategy for influence, finding a way to scale your message through others, that makes sort of a big difference. And so maybe you could just say a little bit something about that.
Yeah. So I have found clearly that in my life that personal connection. So when I got all of these 12 people in the Profiles of Mental Health Courage to sit down and agree to be interviewed and agree to tell it all. I mean, anybody who's read their stories knows that none of these people held back. They really put it all out there. And they did it for a spiritual reason. The spiritual reason, they wanted to help others.
Yeah.
All of them were putting their own lives and reputations at risk. They were talking about things that otherwise are very shameful. And they did it because they don't want other people to have to suffer the indignities of a healthcare system that denied them these basic treatments that could have transformed their lives, opened up possibilities. And the fact that they're not stuck in how the world did them wrong, but they're trying to make the world right, to me is just
Yeah.
explosive. And so I think people respond to that. I mean, there's Miss Tony Dreyer. I mean, her life is, you just can't even begin to fathom the amount of trauma and hardship she has suffered in her life. And she's the most joyful person you could ever meet. And she spends her life helping other women who, like her, have both addiction and mental illness and who are caught up in the criminal justice system. She
Yeah.
has all of these women come out of Rikers Island and she helps them at their new lives. And I guarantee, knowing her as I do, that they all come to her and tell her the worst horror stories you could come up with.
Yeah.
And then she can tell her story. And I don't care who comes with what they think is the worst story in the world. When they hear hers, they're like humbled
Yeah.
by that amount of suffering. And because she can identify with that, she also shows them the possibilities.
Mhm.
And that's why recovery is so powerful. People who have been able to overcome that have the, you have the most influence by your actions rather than your words. And of course, in Washington, it's how do you make the spin? How do you make the words fit? And it's harder and more elusive to talk about how do you move people's action. Um,
Yeah.
so, it's got to be imbued with a spiritual dimension.
I hope folks will check it out, Profiles of Mental Health Courage. I loved it. I loved your first book, A Common Struggle. And, Congressman, I think that you have really demonstrated how through one's own personal story and persistence, you can make a huge impact. And we're just so grateful that you spent time with us today, sharing your story, and just really grateful for the work that you're doing. And I know that you're going to continue to keep doing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and appreciate your having me on very much.
Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver. We help clients transform complexity into clarity with people-centered strategies. Whether you're looking to elevate the influence of your brand or your leaders, check out socialdriver.com to learn more. For show notes or to nominate a guest, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn.